Hey everyone, we're back with author interview number 3 with the lovely Leslie Penelope, known on her works as L. Penelope. Leslie Penelope has been writing since she could hold a pen and loves getting lost in the worlds in her head. She is an award-winning author of fantasy and paranormal romance. She was born in the Bronx just after the birth of hip-hop, but left before she could acquire an accent. Equally left and right-brained, she studied film at Howard University and minored in computer science. This led to a graduate degree in multimedia and a career in website development. She's also an award-winning independent filmmaker, co-founded a literary magazine, and sometimes still dreams in HTML. Leslie lives in Maryland with her husband and their furry dependents. I'm going to be talking to Leslie today about Song of Blood and Stone, and that is the first book in the Earthsinger Chronicles. In L. Penelope's thrilling epic fantasy Earthsinger series, the orphan Jasminda possesses a magical ability feared by her own people. But when war threatens her homeland, Jasminda's Earth Song may be the only thing that can prevent the bloodshed and heal the hearts of two nations. I hope that you enjoy my interview, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you very much for agreeing to have this conversation. And I just finished the last couple of lines. I like to keep the last bit of, I'm reading the Song of Blood and Stone, the last couple of lines over Audible, like I just finished, and I'm fresh in my feelings about it.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm really, I had such a journey listening to this book, and I can't wait to get into it and talk to you about it. But Leslie, first, thank you very much for participating in this interview and giving me and everybody who's going to watch it an opportunity to get to know you a little bit. Before we get into, because we're dealing with a series, I'm just going to talk about the first book, but we'll talk about the second book more vaguely. I want to just talk to you about you and how you became a writer, how you decided what you wanted to write, and I get the sense that there may be a bit of a transition in terms of like the genre, what you're writing from some things that I've read online. So I'd love to get into that with you. But first, tell us a little bit about you as a writer. How did you come to become a writer?
Sure. Yeah. I've always been a writer. So I started writing when I was 5 years old. I was like when I wrote my first story, which I actually still have. My mom was a teacher. She taught me to read pretty early, and I was always a big fan of reading. And I was really, really shy. So writing was my main way to express myself. And I was in writers' workshops all through elementary school. Like in the summertime, I would go to writing workshops at the local community college. And that was a thing. And so writing classes, anytime I could take a writing class, I was on literary magazines in high school and college. And so, yeah, I didn't think it was a realistic career goal to be a writer, but it was always something that was in my heart. And even when I majored in film production at Howard, and that was kind of my way of being creative. And I was going to be a script writer or an editor and tell stories. And that wasn't all that much more realistic of a career goal than being a writer, but it seems like, well, you could do other things, you have other skills. But yeah, I still wasn't thinking about it as a real thing until I got married and moved to Virginia. So I was in a new place and I didn't know anybody and I worked from home, and I saw a flyer for these writing classes. And I was like, oh, well, I've been writing, but just for me. And this is a way that I can meet people and focus on something that I love. And so once I started taking the writing classes and then eventually going to workshops, like week-long writers workshops like VONA and Hurston Write, which is for Black writers at DC, then I was like, oh, well, maybe I can actually pursue this like more seriously and get published and that kind of thing. So that's the basic story.
And how would you describe yourself as a writer? Like, what is it that you write, and how did you come in to decide, like, this is the kind of writing I want to do. This is who I want to write for. When did that come into fruition?
Yeah, so I write fantasy and paranormal romance. And I consider myself, those are the two things that I really love to read. And I feel like that's where my writing wants to go, even when I try to write other things.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't a romance reader initially. I've been a science fiction and fantasy reader for a long time. I discovered Octavia Butler when I was in college, like early, like freshman year of college. And so I read everything I could from her. Then I was reading any Black female speculative fiction author, Tananarive Due and Nalo Hopkinson, and just anyone I could find. And that kind of formed my aesthetic. And also just the authors I had loved when I was younger, like Gloria Naylor and even Toni Morrison, who they aren't really considered speculative, but they're doing speculative things. There's ghosts and there's magic and there's, conjure and all these kinds of things that, even though their genre is more literary. So just kind of the canon of Black literature just includes so much magic and these mystical aspects. And then reading science fiction and just loving fantasy and loving things like Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and things that are just like a little bit weird. And they really just kind of formed. So whenever I was writing something, there was always something magical or something fantastical happening in it. And then I got into paranormal romance as an adult, reading people like Nalini Singh and Kresley Cole, and loving that and then also YA fantasy. When I first got my Kindle, and my reading just shot up. So I got one of the first Kindles, I think it was like 2008.
Oh, cool.
And because my bookshelf space was maxed out, and I had moved every year, right? So I was like, oh, I can buy way more books with this little thing. And so I did. And I was just reading a lot more than ever, even before. So yeah, all of those things kind of combined so that when I was writing my own stories, they were coming out with magic, and they were coming out with fantasy aspects or paranormal aspects.
I don't read a lot of romance, and I don't read romance. The only time I'll come into a romantic scene is if it's in one of the science fiction or fantasy books that I'm currently like reading. Mm-hmm. I found this year that a lot of the books that I'm reading are actually, well, not a lot, but more than usual, the books that I'm reading have like an actual romance sort of plot line, mm-hmm. which I'm enjoying, because when I was younger, I used to read Anne Rice. It's like, I'm talking really, really young, back mm-hmm. in the decade when I was really young. So Anne Rice, Danielle Steele, V.C. Andrews. And so, yeah, right? So there was a lot of romance, inappropriate for the age I was reading at, but we won't go there. But there was a lot of like romance in those stories, right? And then I think like when I started reading more like Octavia Butler, and I love Nalo Hopkinson, a lot of those stories didn't really center romantic relationships. So I noticed that when I read Song of Blood and Stone, I was really intrigued by the romance between Jacinda and Jack. And I was just wondering about like, how do you decide how much of what you put mm-hmm. into the story? Because I know for me, even because I read Black science fiction and fantasy, like romance in terms of the love interest, in terms of power in the relationship, like agency, things like patriarchy and all of those kinds of things, are all wrapped up in love, desire, sensualness. So is violence. And you pick up on those themes, at least certainly in the first book. So I'm curious as to what changes the story when you get a romantic or sexual or sensual plot in there, and what are the things that you think about in terms of the message you want to send through what you write?
Yeah, I initially wanted this to be a fantasy romance. And as through the iterations and like the revisions, it has a strong romantic thread. I don't know if you would consider it a romance in this traditional sense, but it was important to me to show, especially when I have Black characters, the full breadth of experience and falling in love. And I really enjoy reading love stories. If a book doesn't have a love story, I kind of miss it. I was like, oh, I wish it would have one. That's just my personal preference. So, but I saw this Song of Blood and Stone, specifically the first book, as sort of a fairy tale. And then there's refugees that came in. So it's a fairy tale, but it was very grounded in the real world, even though it's fantasy. But romantic relationships, I think, are just a part of many people's experiences, and especially in escapism, and showing a Black woman falling in love feels very important to me. And having sort of just that fullness of like whole person being shown on the page. And so when thinking about the mix between like action and adventure and fantasy aspects and romance, it's kind of just an intuitive mix. Like I know what I like to read, and I'm telling the story that I want to read, which includes, you know, people falling in love, but also a real plot. So that's kind of why what takes it away from being just a romance is that the whole point of the plot is not whether these two people are going to get together. It's, you know, the rest of the story, but them working together and finding common ground, because it's sort of a star-crossed love story, is just as important as the other aspects to me.
Let's just talk a little bit about the Song of Blood and Stone, Song of Blood and Stone, which I'm going to hold up right now awkwardly, and also hold my mic because that's what we do. So first, what's this story about? How would you describe it? Whenever I read blurbs or synopses of books, I always wonder how the author would describe their own book and if it would be any different than what we actually read on the dust jacket. And can you tell us a little bit about how you went from the first spark of an idea to this book?
Sure. So Song of Blood and Stone is a story about Jasminda, who is biracial. She has magic in a country where magic is hated and feared. And she comes across a captive soldier who is a spy and saves his life. And then they go on this journey to awaken a sleeping goddess and to save her country from war. That's kind of the nutshell version of it. So the spark of the idea was I had a dream. So I had just come back from the VONA writing workshop, which is a week-long workshop where I studied with Junot Diaz, who is just an amazing writer and teacher also. And I learned so much there, and I was so inspired that literally a few days later, I come home and I have this dream, and I wake up and I just started writing. And I wrote the first draft in 2 days. It was 20,000 words in 2 days. It just kind of poured out of me. And it was obviously very different than the hardcover that you have, I think is almost 90,000 words. But I saw in the dream, I saw Jasminda, I saw this woman on the porch with a shotgun in her hands. And these people, you know, are coming, she can see them coming down the mountain trail towards her like isolated home. It was the first thing I had. And the second image I had was of Jack. And as he's captured, there's a point early in the book where he's knocked down and he gets back up again. He has this really fierce look on his face. And that was inspired by a movie that I had seen. And so those two images together really were the beginning. It was like, who are these people? What is the situation that they're in? And I just started writing. The first scene that I wrote was Jasminda on the porch like that, like waiting, seeing these people coming and knowing that she had to protect herself. And I just learned about her as I was going. And the book has been through a lot of changes, a lot of different versions. Technically, there are three different versions in the world. I originally self-published it. And then I did a big rewrite for the hardcover with St. Martin's Press once they approached me to republish the books. And then there's a special edition that has an additional 40,000 words in it. So it's been through a lot, but the story has basically been the same. It's always the story of this woman who has been isolated and looked down upon her whole life, both for her skin color and for her magical abilities, and how she has to, basically go into this world, into this country that hates her, and save it from itself almost, and save it from, the bad guy, but also save it from itself.
I love the opening scene, and I don't think I have the special edition, right?
That's the hardcover, yeah.
Is this a special edition with the extra 40,000 words?
No, that the hardcover doesn't have the extra words. But okay. It's the same storyline. The Jack and Jasminda storyline is always the same.
Okay. And so the scene that I'm going to talk about is going to probably be in all of them, I think, because I think it was a very profound establishing scene, which is her in the post office, where she gets that letter and we see people responding to her. How did you decide, like, obviously with this cover, we know Jasminda is Black, but how did you how did you write her as a Black character, and what did you do to make the reader really fully understand the challenges of racism that she had to deal with on a day-to-day basis? What was that like for you?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, microaggressions and macroaggressions for her too. And that was really just pulling from my life and experiences. I grew up mostly in New Jersey and in Maryland, and I had the experience of being like the first Black kid at this school that I went to that had ever been there, and just being in really white environments for a long time. Even in Maryland, my school was only 10% Black. So there's just through my life as a Black person in America and in these white spaces, pulling from the feelings and some of, changing experiences, but similar experiences. It just came out. Like, this is my first book. So I think your first book often is more autobiographical than other books.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that all books are kind of about you all the time, or versions of you and pieces of you. But the piece that I put of myself into this book is a lot of Jasminda's experiences, and sort of the anger that she has, the isolation that she feels about kind of being the only one, and the way that people treat her. So that came out. And it's second world fantasy. So yes, Jasminda is Black, but there is a different version of Blackness, I guess. You take away Africa and the slave trade, but you still have human beings who are going to hate each other for some reason or another. They're always going to find a way to separate each other and to find divisions and hatred. And so I have the magical aspect too as being another separating factor, in addition to the skin color, because the skin color doesn't have the same baggage that we have, but it's still a difference, and it's a difference that this society has chosen to find as offensive for some reason. Later in the series, I also wanted to show other ways of being. So I have other countries and cultures and people where it's not so much of an issue, but I did want to have some mirroring of our own world while also imagining something better, maybe the next level of where we can get to.
Because we have Jasminda as like the main perspective in this story, we watch her experience patriarchy, we watch her and sexism and the vulnerability of living in a home on her own, her vulnerability with respect to the state, which is represented for the most part by men. We have her also as like a racial and ethnic and magical minority in a way. We also encounter her, though, as somebody who does have some privileges because of her mixed background. As well, toward the end of the book, we see her kind of comment on a queer couple, and we see this queer couple through her own experience of having privilege and also experiencing marginalization. So I wonder about how those identities impact some of like the tropes and cliches that we might run into in YA fantasy, maybe in paranormal romance, which I admit I don't read a lot of. But did you have to make specific choices not to repeat things that you'd seen in other books? And what were those choices like?
Yeah, there were choices that I made to repeat things. Like, I wanted to deal with patriarchy. You very easily can have a fantasy world where you're not dealing with those things. And I think that's great. But at the same time, I think fantasy and speculative fiction in general are great ways to comment upon our reality. And I hadn't seen I hadn't seen my view, necessarily somewhere else. So there are places where I chose to cleave to what we know. So there is a queer couple, and in this place, in this book, and in this country, they are not accepted. And you do have the patriarchy and the racism, and so those things I stayed with. But I did understand that in order to have sort of the vision of the story that I was trying to tell, it's going to be different. One of the critiques that my editor made at St. Martin's was more hero's journey. And so the hero's journey is a good structure to follow. I think it makes a story enjoyable oftentimes. How you can take that and sort of make it your own, so it's not so predictable and cliche, as you said, is important. And just by virtue of the fact of having a Black woman as the main character, as the heroine of the story, is going to change it. You know,
Mhm.
we don't see that as often as we see the traditional hero's journey with your white farm boy or whatever.
Mm.
So just the
Like
characters
orphan,
themselves. Oh yes.
like the white young orphan. Like he's always a
Right.
hero.
Yeah, exactly. You've seen that same hero over and over, the same time period, the medieval fantasy time period.
Yeah.
I knew I didn't want to do that. So the changes that I made are, in my mind, I was trying to bring freshness to some of the tropes while adhering to the tropes because a, I liked, they are enjoyable. They are something that's a touchstone that can bring the familiarity for readers while showing them something they haven't necessarily seen before.
Mhm.
And also bringing that new perspective onto it. It was important to have the diversity. So we have the queer couple, we have Aunt Vanessa and Clove, and, showing sort of analogs to the real life discrimination that they feel, but they appear elsewhere in the series also, and in a way that's more accepted. So having the options. And so this first book is like laying the groundwork of the familiar in an unfamiliar way, so that I could then step off of that and do something different with the rest of the series and show you a different view.
I really want to talk about magic, the magic systems. I'd like to talk about this. For me, very much felt like this goddess mother type like entity. And I love sort of I'll let you tell the story of that, but how tell us about the magic system. Tell us about how it works. And what was it like to just create it for yourself? I'm really interested about, like, I really like when I read books where magic is not a surprise. It's
Mm-hmm.
part of the way that the world works, but it ends up being commodified or controlled in some kind of way. Um, so how did you approach that? Especially like the magical, I know I'm not letting you speak, but the magical, the magical and political
Mm-hmm.
piece. Like I'm noticing that I love stories where we recognize, everybody in the society recognize that magic is extremely powerful, but at the same time that magic then ends up being controlled, and the people who might have access to it might not be in the top echelons of society, but in common sense terms they could potentially be. So
Right.
how did you approach the
Yeah.
building and the magical system?
So Earth Song is an energy. It's like Earth Song is the energy of life, basically. And there's other kinds of magic that come out in the series, but the core is this Earth Song. So every living creature has a song, and all of them kind of blend together for this ocean of energy that people who have the ability to manipulate Earth Song, the Earth Singers, can tap into and use. And they have different strengths, different abilities. It's sort of like they bring the energy into themselves and then they can manipulate it. And it just felt like a very natural, organic way to have magic. Um, I thought of it initially many years ago. Someone told me, someone who was very into energy and reading and woo-woo things, that the earth has a vibration of a certain note, and I was like, oh, okay. And I think that stayed in my brain for a long time. And Earth Song came out of that. Like, if this energy has a vibration, then that's what it would be. Um, and so creating the magic that way, figuring out what it could do. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, like how would it feel to manipulate it? What could you do? How much power? Because Jasmine starts as a very weak singer. Her magical ability is relatively weak in comparison to other characters. So, that is one thing that limits it, because it's important to have limits on magic. Also in this world, the magic users have their magic stolen. So by our antagonist, our main villain, and he's called the True Father, and he is born without magic, and he covets it. So he steals other people's magic, and that's just a metaphor for a lot of things. But because the people, the Black people have magic, and it is being stolen from them in large part. That was just something that came to me that felt right. That is something it felt right in terms of the themes of the book and the series. And the more powerful country, or the more resource rich country of people who do not have magic, don't like it. They hate it. They're afraid of it because they know that it could easily overtake them. And so you've got a couple of different ways that the magic is being controlled. It's being stolen. It's being just looked at pejoratively and feared by the people who are more in charge. And so that kind of political power. So when we have Jasminda coming in to this country, and she is at this point basically the only magical user. She's facing a lot of conflict. But then we have this goddess figure who's the queen who sleeps, who is literally the goddess that they all pray to. And she has been in this magically induced slumber for hundreds of years, and they don't know what she looks like. And so that you have this. No spoilers. She doesn't look how they expect her to look.
Listen, the first book's when I think, don't worry about the spoilers. If you're good with them, I'm good with them, because like it made me laugh. Like I just found it so ironic. So yes, please speak on it.
Yeah. So we have at the, the queen who sleeps is revealed by the end of the book, and she is essentially Black. She looks like the Lagrimari, which are the Black people, which is what Desmond looks like. So you have this nation of people who have, are not really, they find out that their goddess looks like the people that they hate and has the magic of the people that they hate. And one of the things I thought was important was, they don't like magic, but they have this deity who's obviously magical. And that sort of like contradiction just is how religion kind of works, I think. It is how a lot of belief systems and faith actually works. And I just liked the irony of it. And, obviously that goes into the rest of the series. And then, the true father, who's the one who's been stealing the magic, is actually her twin brother. But because of the genetics of this world, they're kind of binary. So when you have, your parents, you can be mixed and have traits of one or the other. You either have magic or you don't. You're dark or you're light. And just kind of playing around with expectations and what people know about how history gets hidden, how the reality gets hidden, how the fact that these were kind of one people that were separated artificially. And all of that hatred and fear that's built up over the past centuries is completely artificial. Mm-hmm. But the question now is, can they get over it? And can they ever unite,
Mm-hmm. So what has been your task, as the series has continued? Can you give us, a sense? Like people who are watching this, like I've read the first book. People who are watching this may have read beyond that. Mm-hmm. Who knows? So what can you say to those who are curious about starting the series, but also maybe thinking about like what they might look forward to as they continue?
Yeah, so the series, I wanted it to be just like a mashup of everything that I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. So it includes, strong romantic threads in each book. There's basically a different love story being told in each book, while at the same time, the overarching story is the one of these two countries that have been at war for 500 years, that have all of these divisions among them. And now they are poised on the edge of coming together. Can they come together? Can they unite? That question is present all the way up until the end of the series. Mm-hmm. And, I was initially writing it years ago, but so many of the things that I was writing, like the refugee crisis, mm-hmm. initially when I started writing this book in 2013, it was a different one that is, when you might read it in the future, or when you read it now, it might be a different refugee crisis. It's always going to be those issues happening in the world, and these questions of, can we come together as people? Can we find peace? Can we find unity? Can we not? What is going to happen when people from different backgrounds come together and are forced to live together? And even in the United States, when maybe without refugees, we've got these deep divides politically and culturally and socially, and we're living in this place together. How are we going to move forward? So there's action adventure. There's that kind of political question and strife, but there's also just, personal growth and people from different backgrounds falling in love and in one way answering that question on a personal level, while at the meta level, the question is still kind of ongoing.
For me, one of the things that I found, it caused me to think, like the Jack character. I don't know if it was just how I read, but I felt like I didn't get a lot of physical description of Jack. I'm not sure if that was something that you did on purpose, but what it allowed me to do was to not focus so much on Jack, which was great. Like in terms of his physicality, what he looked like. We know Jesminda is hot for him, but we don't like, I don't even remember the color of his eyes or anything like that. It wasn't really a focus. And I wondered if you did that on purpose. And then I also wonder about I mean, when I think about romance and when I think about paranormal romance, just sort of on a surface level, because I have no expertise in this area, but I know that themes like consent, themes around like the gaze, right? So when you write a sex scene and like there's like sex on page, which I support. But when you write sex and sensualness and desire and all of those, like there's so many ways you can do that. There's so many ways that you can write through the gaze, right? Like whose bodies do we emphasize, whose pleasure is central in the description. So I'm just wondering about like, you know, let me just intersect that with the idea of like feminist writing. Where I know that there are certain authors who are writing feminist science fiction, feminist fantasy, are really trying to tackle some of the very sexist traditions around writing romance and around just questions about power and consent. Did you take those up when you were writing the sex scenes, the sensual scenes, and the gaze? And what was that like for you?
So on the descriptions, I purposefully didn't describe any skin colors in this book. Everyone is described by their hair color or their eye color. And so that was just a way for me to sort of take a step back. I knew what I think the characters are, but I don't love describing people a lot. I like to picture them in my mind. And so that was a conscious decision on some level to keep things, not to be obsessed about skin tone and skin color, because this is a fantasy world and the races are not necessarily what you expect our races to be, and like I said, our baggage from that. As for the sex scenes, I was coming at them from character and character development. And when I write sex scenes, a lot of people, I've heard readers like skim or skip sex scenes. And I think that if you skip it, then the author has not done their job properly, because it shouldn't just be there to be like salacious. It's there as a way to build the character, build the relationships, and show that depth. And so I come at it from character. And I think that, I can't remember exactly whose POV. I think it might have been both of their POVs for the sex scenes. Definitely Jasminda has a POV, but I think Jack might. I just don't remember.
There was both. Like I remember that like one of their first sensual encounters, Jack was struggling with himself and his desire, and had to like go back and sleep on the floor.
Right.
That very much was like written from his perspective. But then I remember in one of the first sex scenes, I think it was both of them. I remember it being both of them. My bias, like my bias is the woman's gaze, the fem's gaze. That's my bias. So, but I do know that you wrote from both.
Yeah. And so I thought that, consent obviously is important because it's been missing from romance historically.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of issues with that are well noted. I think that most people, at least most authors that I know, women authors that I know, are dealing with romance and from a feminist gaze, from a very woman-centered gaze, where we assume that, 80 to 90% of the readers of actual romance do identify as women. So that is the focus. And there's all different kinds of romance, and it goes in lots of different places that there is a reader for, and I might not be that reader. You might not be that reader.
Right.
So yeah, for me, it's character. It is, definitely trying to make it something. There is a lot of, in other books in the series and other relationships that I describe in the series, consent comes into play in a big way as well. And I'm kind of exploring different kinds of relationships. And in this one, it was kind of simple to me. It's like these people don't necessarily have a romantic conflict between themselves. There's the external conflict. And I wanted to build the relationship and show Jasminda having the feeling of being wanted, and being wanted physically, because that's something that she hasn't had. So I wasn't so much thinking specifically in the way that a lot of people are with the feminist ideals. I think it's sort of just intrinsic that it be something that was palatable to me. So something that was enthusiastically consented to by both people. And that really just went into the character and the relationship.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Great. It's great.
Thank you.
And I also, there are lots of characters that I didn't like. And I also like it when I have strong negative feelings toward characters, because that tells me that like the author did their job for sure. What other writing projects do you have going on right now? And for readers who are interested in getting to know you, where can we find you? What's exciting you about your writing journey at this point? Because it's been a long road, right? Since Song of Blood and Stone, right? You have produced much more. You have much more on the table. I have heard that there's some interesting maybe transitions or changes or explorations happening. So talk about that, please.
So yes, Song of Blood and Stone is a long series. There's 4 novels, there's 3 novellas, and it's been a big part of my life. I'm very proud of it. I love it all. We just announced my new book that is coming out in August or the summer of 2022, hopefully August, with Orbit Books. It's called The Monsters We Defy. And it is a historical fantasy that takes place in 1925 in Washington, D.C. I'm super excited about it. So it's a fantasy heist story. And it's based off a real character who was involved in the 1919 riots in DC. Mm-hmm. And I sort of take her, that real person, and imagine her 5 years later, what happened to her. And in a heist story that has, you know, a little bit of a love story in there, but it's about found family. And my main character is someone who was born with a veil, so she can speak to the spirits. So I'm bringing in elements of the things that I loved, like, you know, African-American, like conjure magic. And of course, heists are always super fun. It was really great being able to look into those. So it's a departure from the second world fantasy, really grounding it. I did a lot of research on the time period and to try to make it as realistic as possible, but adding the fantasy elements. And so, yeah, it's going to be very, very, very cool, I hope.
I'm very much looking forward to it. I like reading through an author's body of work because it's nice to see the different twists and turns, to see what remains the same. Like sometimes, even if a writer has written a number of different types of books or types of literary works, you can still find their signature. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see, like, you know, what imprint is left from some of your previous work. And in terms of like traversing through, it's the Earthsinger series, right? The Earthsinger Chronicles. So how would you recommend people sort of get into this? How did the novellas fit into the longer form pieces?
I designed them to be one novella in between each full-length novel, and there is a reading order on my website. So you've got Song of Blood and Stone, then Breath of Dust and Dawn goes in between, Whispers of Shadow and Flame. Let's see if I can know all the titles of my books. Hush of Storm and Sorrow, Cry of Metal and Bone, Echoes of Ash and Tears, and then in a month, August of 2021, Requiem of Silence comes out, which is the final book in the series. So the novellas are prequels, but they also lead you into the next book. That was the idea, that they would introduce a character or a situation that's going to be featured in the upcoming book, and they kind of bridge the gap. So they're optional reading, of course, but I think that for the full experience, read them all. Why not?
Cool. Obviously, yes, I do. I like this cover. But I noticed that the series has a completely different look to it. So I think I'm gonna get that one so that I can get all of them, which will be really, really cool. So question about writing in community and writing community. Mm-hmm. So what is it, you know, where are your places that you go to be with other writers? Do you engage at all with readers? Like, how do you keep yourself motivated, especially in this, you know, COVID times, to write and produce?
Mm-hmm. I started the pandemic on deadline. So I know it was difficult for a lot of artists to keep producing, especially with all the upheavals. Mm-hmm. It was really helpful for me to be on the deadline. It forced me to write. But writing community is extremely important. It's really the only way I've been able to get anything done. Yeah. From the first manuscript I ever finished, I did it with my community around me. So I had met other writers at the workshops that I went to, and we kept in touch. And to this day, I write basically every morning. I get onto Google Hangouts with one of my best friends who I've known since college, but we also went to a writing workshop together after we had sort of gone our separate ways, and we came back together at Hurston Wright, and we meet and we write together for a few hours. I only ever finished NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, because we got together with people all over the country, and we would get together every day and do our writing sprints. So for the writers out there who are struggling, find someone, an accountability partner to help bring you over the line. Because really, that's how I stay motivated. The days I don't write with her, I stay in bed longer, and I'll eventually get to the writing, because at this point I do have deadlines, and as a professional, I have to do it just about every day, like 5 days a week. But it's so much easier with someone else and with support. Mm-hmm. I do engage with readers. I have a Facebook group that I don't love being on Facebook, so I'm not super active on there, but I try to pop in. I have a newsletter, which I'm more active on. I have a podcast called My Imaginary Friends that is a weekly podcast. It's sort of just like a journal of my writing life, what I've been going through, the ups and downs of every week. And that's, it's on my website. It's video and audio podcast. So a lot of readers join me there and just join me on the journey and hear about all the highs and lows of this path that I've chosen. But yeah, the community is so important. I had joined organizations. I had joined RWA, which is the Romance Writers of America, years ago, and was really active in that, and found that was really helpful. They, of course, had a very public implosion last year that showed a lot of the faults in terms of just racism within the organization. And
this on Twitter.
There was a lot about it. A lot of people left. Now they do, they have new leadership. They have a Black president, and I think the incoming president is also Black. So there are people there who are taking the reins and are trying to save the organization so that it is a place where everyone can go and feel comfortable, because it has so many wonderful resources. Mm-hmm. And so I think those sorts of organizations, RWA was also really helpful. My local chapter in Maryland, being active there, going to workshops. As I grew as a writer, I was teaching workshops and mentoring, because giving back to, all of the writers who helped me, that's really important too. So yeah.
Cool. Well, as we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share with the Booktube community?
I love Booktube. I
love that you said that, because sometimes writers aren't really aware of what Booktube is. Like they might have like a vague sense, but we love you too. So thank you for saying that.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. If I could review more, I feel a little awkward reviewing as an author, but I do appreciate all of the reviewers and the people who are talking about books and showing love. It's really important. Reviews are so important to us. Whether or not I can actually watch or read my own reviews is immaterial. I love that they're out there and people do them. So please continue. And I have more projects coming up. I'm working on another self-published project, hopefully releasing at the beginning of next year, which is a futuristic paranormal romance. And that just went to the editor like 2 days ago. So I have more books coming, and I'm still active, and I'll be here hopefully for a long time.
I hope so too. Well, thank you very much, for your time, for speaking to me, for your candor, and for your excitement. I hope that this interview will be an opportunity for people to continue reading your work, to people who haven't yet come into contact with your work to get excited about and to read it as well. And I'm looking forward to also watching your journey too. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great.
So I first think about the fact that she wants us to experience her characters through the full breadth of love. And the first time she said that, I wasn't sure exactly what she meant. But then reflecting on it a little bit more, I realized that, especially with Black women, sometimes we experience being sexualized, right? We don't really... Often on the page, when we are being trivialized and stereotyped, we see only a small part of ourselves. We might not see us as sexual agents. We might not see us as, being unsure of love, falling into love, falling out of love, making bold decisions about how we're going to engage in love. And I think that, at least for me reading the first book, I really saw her main character make a decision to love Jack. And I really appreciated being a part of her emotional interior while she did all of those things, you know, while she took all of those steps into love. So it was really nice. And as somebody who doesn't read a lot of romance, it's just nice to hear an author talk about love. So that was really cool. She also talked about the irony of religion. And I know that there are lots of folks in our communities who are super religious. I am not religious. I used to be, I am not anymore. But I do find religion fascinating. And there is a bit of a spoiler in our discussion, but let's just say that the goddess that was worshipped by the community ended up taking on a form and a shape that the community didn't expect. And I think that's really interesting, because for as much as we say, at least me, from a Christian background, as much as we say, like, you shouldn't put a face or an image to God because God is unknowable in that way, it's so interesting how we think about God as white and male. And it was just really amazing in this story to see that get disturbed, and to really have Leslie talk about the irony of that as a deliberate choice while she was writing this first book. So that's super exciting. And then just talking about, you know, being the only one, right? For many of us, for many Black folks, we know what it's like to be the only one. And in fantasy, we've got the chosen one trope. So what happens when the chosen one trope meets the only one reality, or the only one trope for Black folks? What happens when they mush together? When the person who is the salvation, who is the savior, is also the one who experiences isolation and hate? How does that come together? And what happens when you sprinkle love on top of that? There's just a lot there to explore. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about those or any other reflections you might have in the comments. I'm gonna go ahead and choose a Harvest of Survival affirmation deck card, and let's see if the quote connects to the discussion with Leslie Penelope. We shall see. I think it will. It always works out this way. The quote is from Octavia E. Butler. It is our first Octavia E. Butler quote that we have pulled. Oh, yes. Okay, so the quote is, "Kindness eases change, love quiets fear." So of course, we have a quote with the word love in it. Kindness eases change, love quiets fear. And the question, what is possible if we release fear? So think about the conversation with Penelope, what came up for you during the discussion, what came up for me in the reflections, and just reading and writing with purpose. And answer the question, what is possible if we release fear? I'd love to hear your answers in the comments. And of course, why am I asking you to answer these questions? Because we are going to be drawing another 2022 Melanin Eclectic Reading Planner for this particular interview. If you want to be entered into the draw for this one, you have to do 4 things. Say it with me now. You need to like this video. You need to subscribe to this channel. You need to share this video. And then you need to comment with a response to this prompt, what is possible if we release fear, in the comments below. I'm going to be selecting one winner from the comments, and you will be entered into the pre-order for the 2022 Melanin Eclectic Reader, which you will receive later in the year. Thanks very much for being a part of this discussion, and remember to always read with purpose. See you next time.